Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jack Samet. I am the president of PLATO, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this, our second colloquium of the year. This is our October colloquium, and befitting the time frame, it has an election aspect to it, as I'm sure you will see. In fact, I think some of you may have had the pleasure of voting for our speaker in the past. Many of you may have voted from more than once, hopefully not in the same election. In any event, I've got a couple of brief announcements and then we'll get started. First, I want to indicate that the proceedings today are for members only and their guests. They are being recorded and they will be available on a delayed review basis on the PLATO YouTube channel and also by link reference on the PLATO website. I have two announcements I'd like to make. One has to do with the PLATO website, and that is, as of this morning, there is now a make an online payment button on the PLATO member website. This is to facilitate payments of any sort you might make to PLATO, dues, hopefully annual giving, which is about to start soon, and it's not entirely inappropriate that that's starting around the time of the election campaigns, and everybody's in a giving spirit. And hopefully you all catch that and apply it to PLATO as well. So we have that button now. It just became available this morning, and I think it will make payment more convenient, and you won't have to worry about mails, and you certainly won't have to worry about appearing in person in the PLATO office to make payment, as was the case in the past, which obviously is impractical now. The other item that I wanted to mention is, again, in the election political spirit, our preferential ballot is available online. And this, of course, as you well know, is a ballot not for candidates, but for SDGs, for courses. And this particular ballot pertains not to the immediately upcoming trimester, but to the one that begins in spring, in May 2021. And the courses you select now, this is kind of a primary election, if you will, for courses. And the courses that you select now will be offered for registration in the final election that you make closer to the May trimester. So look over those items, pick the course that you're interested in, and this is truly an electoral college concept because you, the members, are the electors of the courses you wind up attending. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce the chairperson of the colloquium committee, Hank Zangwill. Hank?
Jack, thank you very much. I appreciate all of you joining us today for the second of our colloquium for this year. We are very pleased and delighted and honored to have with us as our guest today, Zev Yaroslavsky, who has been a leading and an influential voice in LA public affairs for almost 50 years. Zev was first elected to office in 1975, at that time stunning the political establishment by winning the LA City Council coveted 5th district seat at the age of 26. While he was on the city council, he served for 20 years. The council was responsible for, among other things, negotiating to host the 1984 Summer Olympics. And he led the efforts on the city council to reform the Los Angeles Police Department. Following his service on the city council, Zev served for 20 years as a member of the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors before his term limits ended his tenure in 2014. While a supervisor, Zev helped shape county policy on public finance, transportation, homelessness, public health, the environment, public safety, and the arts. Among other projects, he championed efforts to rebuild and modernize the Hollywood Bowl Amphitheater and was instrumental in the development of architect Frank Gehry's iconic Walt Disney Concert Hall. Currently, Zev is the director of the Los Angeles Initiative at the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs and also has an affiliation with the UCLA History Department. Please join me in welcoming Zev Yaroslavsky. And as a reminder, if during the course of the speech you have any questions you would like to ask Zev at the conclusion of his remarks, please hit the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, type in your questions, and we'll get to as many of those as possible at the end of Zeb's presentation.
Well, thank you, Hank, and thank you all very much for joining on this webinar this afternoon. I am thrilled that the Dodgers decided to play at 5 o'clock and not at 1:30. Although I can't say that it would have been a better show, but they're on the mend now, so let's keep our fingers crossed. Anyway, I'm delighted to be here. When Hank first contacted me quite a number of weeks ago, I'm no rocket scientist, but I said October 15th. That's going to be just 2 or 3 weeks before the election. Maybe we ought to talk about what's happening in the election. And boy, is there a lot to talk about. And I thought I'd give you a not a political view exclusively from a politician's point of view, but I also at UCLA and at the Luskin School, I do a bit of public opinion research. I have followed this obviously religiously over the years. And I've got this election kind of under a microscope like I did in 2016. And at that time, 4 years ago, I was actually asked at a meeting like this, except it was in person, how I thought the election was going to come out that night. This was on election day, November 8th, I believe, last year, 4 years ago. And I shocked everybody by saying, I think it's a 50-50 pick'em. And at the time, as you may recall, nobody thought that Trump would win. Maybe it would be close, maybe it would hinge on Florida, but nobody thought he would win. And when I looked at the data that was coming in from all over the country, particularly in Pennsylvania and Michigan, a little less so in Wisconsin. I wasn't paying much attention to Wisconsin, but it was clear that that the polls were Hillary's lead in the polls were shrinking. They were shrinking steadily to the point where it was within the statistical margin of error as we went into the weekend before the election. And typically, when your momentum is going in a particular way, the weekend before the election, it's probably going to carry through to that following Tuesday. And at that time, a good percentage of the votes that were cast in the country were cast on election day. That will not be the case this time, and it's a major difference. So I'm looking at the election this time, and I have an old philosophy. It's probably in my Jewish genes that I look at everything with a glass half empty viewpoint, because if the worst case scenario happens, I'm not shocked and surprised. And if it's better than the worst case scenario, I'm pleasantly surprised. So I can't lose. So I am kind of a pessimist generally. I always look at the worst case scenario. And I don't allow myself to get caught up in the euphoria of polls, and I'll tell you why. And that's why I'll give you my conclusion now, which is not exactly a stellar conclusion, but I don't think this election is over yet for a very simple couple of reasons. One is we don't have a majority vote system here, as you all know. The Electoral College was mentioned in the introductory remarks. That is the way we elect our presidents. There is potentially some hanky-panky to be played by certain states that are controlled by Republican legislators if the election in that state is close. Not clear that they're actually going to go through with it, but then I wouldn't have believed that anybody would try to kidnap and murder the governor of Michigan up until a week ago. The polls in Pennsylvania are not reflective of the polls nationwide. I was on a webinar last night with the former governor and former Homeland Security Secretary from Pennsylvania, Tom Ridge, who has just endorsed Joe Biden, the first Democrat he's ever endorsed and voted for, he announced. And he said, I think you're hearing a vacuum cleaner in the background. It won't last long. I apologize for that. There we go. He said that in Pennsylvania, it's all going to hinge, as it did 4 years ago, on suburban Philadelphia, that in the western part of Pennsylvania, where he's from, there doesn't appear to have been a significant, if any, erosion in Trump's support. That's rural Pennsylvania, outside of beyond Pittsburgh and Allegheny County. So I mention that because we are still today 19 days away from the election. That's an eternity in today's environment. In an era of 24/7 news coverage, where every hour there can be a breaking news story. In fact, breaking news is probably the most often seen icon on television. It's lost all of its credibility, but the fact is that there is breaking news almost every hour on the hour on television. So who knows exactly what's going to happen? But let me give you the optimistic point of view. I deal with a lot of pollsters around the country over the course of a year. I've talked to a few of them in recent days, and some of them feel that the election is on the cusp of a blowout, of a Biden blowout, of a Democratic blowout. And if that's the case, the implications, not just for the White House, but for the United States Senate, are quite profound. The president has not done himself any good in the last couple, 3 weeks. This is not because Joe Biden has become a Winston Churchill. It's because more because there's a comparison between the Trumpian character and the Biden character. And when you compare those two characters, there's no comparison. And people are not happy with what they've seen. I do some commentary on Channel 9. Some of you, the few of you who may watch after a debate, I've done a few commentaries with them. And they asked me after the first debate with Trump and Biden what I thought and who won, and I said I don't think either one of them won. The American people lost. But I went on to say that I feel like I need to take a shower. And as it turned out, of course, Trump was the big loser. People didn't like what they saw. 80 million people watched that. When he gives a rally speech like he did last night in Iowa, 1.5 million, 2 million people watch it on Fox. That debate was watched by 80 million people, and they got to see for an hour and a half the comparison between the characters of these two individuals. And they didn't like what they saw. And I told Channel 9 that night, I said, people are going to have to make a decision. Do they want 4 more years of this, or do they want something different? And I think that's what this election is going to come down to, is do they want 4 more years of this chaos, of these threats to our institutions, an incompetent response to the biggest pandemic we've had in over 100 years, the threat that it's posed to people's lives and health, not to mention to their jobs and their livelihoods. All of the indicators point to the public, the majority of the country for sure has had enough. And it looks like there's certainly Biden is better positioned today at this point, 19 days out, than Hillary was 19 days out in states like Pennsylvania, where I wish it were a little bigger lead, but he's leading somewhere between 5 and 7 points. He's leading in Florida, and his lead is growing, although it's not huge. He's winning in Michigan and Wisconsin. He is basically in a dead heat, maybe a little bit ahead in Arizona. I'm talking about Biden now. He's tied in a dead heat in Ohio. He's either tied or slightly ahead in North Carolina. So there are a lot of states that are in play this year that weren't in play 4 years ago. But most of the ones that I just mentioned are close. In Arizona, it's close. In North Carolina, it's a dead heat. In Ohio, it's a dead heat or maybe a point behind. So we come back to the same old story: Florida, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, and that's where this election is going to be decided. And when you look at some of these states, you could almost pinpoint the county or the neighborhood that's going to decide an election like this. In Michigan, Trump won by only 10,000 votes. I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. There's a suburban county, excuse me, a suburban Detroit county called Macomb County. It's where the phrase Reagan Democrat was invented back in 1980. It's a working class, blue collar auto workers, kind of like the San Fernando Valley used to be in the days when we had manufacturing in the San Fernando Valley. That's Macomb County. Obama won Macomb County in 2008 by 8 points, in 2012 by 9 points, and Trump won it by 18 or 19 points. So there was a 27-point swing in Macomb County. That accounted for far more than 10,000 votes in the state of Michigan, which was the difference in that state's choice of presidential candidates. So I say somewhat facetiously, but not really, is tell me what's going to happen in Macomb County, and I'll tell you what's going to happen in the country, or in Michigan, I'm sorry. Tell me what happens in Florida, and I'll either tell you what the result's going to be, or that we're going to have a long night or a long week. Florida counts all of its votes, all of its absentee votes, or the vote by mail votes that are being sent in now. They count them ahead of the election. They don't report them, but they're in the computer. And once the election is over, election night is over, and the polls close at 7 or 8 o'clock, they push the button and the results come out. About 75 to 80% of the votes that will be cast in Florida will be cast by mail or by absentee ballot, or I guess to some degree, if they have provisional ballots, they would do it. You'll know by 5, 6 o'clock our time on election night, whether it's a too close to call race, which is what it's been for the last 3 or 4 elections. You can't make a call because it's just too close. Or if it is a blowout, as some people are keeping their fingers crossed for, you may see that. If he's ahead by 7 or 8 points, Biden, or Trump for that matter, either one of them is ahead by 5 to 7 points or more, when the first votes report, you can pretty much conclude what the result in Florida is going to be. Now, if he's winning, if Biden is winning in Florida, or wins Florida, there's almost no scenario I can see where he loses the election. He could lose a Michigan or a Wisconsin or a Pennsylvania. And if he has Florida, that will compensate for any one of those states, and maybe even 2 of them, depending on which ones they are. So keep an eye out on Florida. I think their polls close at 7 p.m. Eastern time. At least the part of Florida, which is most of it, that's in the Eastern time zone. There's that panhandle area that is actually in the Central time zone. And I don't know whether they report them at 7 or at 8 o'clock Eastern time, but by 5 o'clock, by the time you sit down for dinner on Tuesday, November 3rd, you're going to have a good idea what's happening in the state of Florida. And then, North Carolina, and which counts its vote. They have a robust vote by mail program. I believe they count their votes ahead of time and then report them as after the polls close. You'll be able to see, one by one, what is happening. Now, let me talk for a second about where this could go wrong. In a close election, well, let me back up. You all know, and you're watching it in real time, the voter suppression campaign that is well underway and has been for some time, but is well underway, perpetrated by the Republican Party and the Trump campaign. You see it most vividly in the state of Georgia, but it's not the only place. But I'll use that as the poster child. I'll use Georgia and Houston, Texas. You watched in the news the last couple of nights where people have waited as long as 11 hours in line to cast a vote in Atlanta, in the urban core of Atlanta, Black neighborhood, communities of color neighborhoods, where they have made it virtually impossible to have a rational voting apparatus. They have too few voting stations. They have too few voting machines, and all of the hoops that you have to jump through results in a big turnout election like this to have somebody have to wait 11 hours. I've observed elections overseas under the auspices of the National Democratic Institute for 30 years or more. And the most compelling one was in Nigeria, where people stand in line for 6 hours outside in the heat, 100 degrees and 100% humidity. I jog 4 miles a day, and I was spent by 10 a.m. Mothers with their babies on their backs were standing there for 6 hours. I never in my wildest dreams could have imagined that such a thing could happen in my country. And here I was over there observing their election. We would have been better off having them observe our election. To wait 11 hours or 4 hours or 2 hours to vote is, especially when it's discriminatory, when the apparatus is insufficient in communities of color, in democratic areas, in the urban core of a city, but in the suburbs, there's no shortage of voting places, you're skewing the result. That's an undermining of the democratic process. When we do observations of elections overseas, and now we observe them here too, you don't just say, well, the vote was counted accurately, the Russians didn't manipulate the vote, so it was a fair election. No, that's not the way it is. If certain people were not able to vote other than by standing in line for 4, 6, or 8 hours, remember 4 years ago in Cleveland, in Cuyahoga County, they had to go to federal court, have the judge keep the polls open because the lines of people still waiting to vote at the closing time were so long. And the federal judge approved it. Now, I don't know who the federal judge is now because they've appointed a lot of new judges and whether they will do that. But those kinds of tactics, that's called voter suppression. Voter suppression is not just asking you to read to recite the Constitution of the United States from memory. It's also these kinds of techniques. Harris County, which is Houston, Texas. Harris County is probably not as big as LA County in geography, but close. It's a very big geography. They probably have 3 or 4 million people in that county. They have one place, one station where they have a voter drop box. Now you can mail your ballot through the U.S. Postal Service, but thanks to Donald Trump, the confidence that people have in the Postal Service, and for good reason, because of this postmaster he's installed there, the mail is not reliable, so people don't want to put it in the mail. I'm not going to put mine in the mail. It took the Department of Motor Vehicles, and part of that is the Department of Motor Vehicles' fault, 2 months to cash my check for my registration on my car. It finally cleared. I was so thrilled. Never been so thrilled to have the state of California take my money. But that's what's happened with the U.S. Postal Service. So people want to drop their ballot in a secure drop box. In Los Angeles County, we have drop boxes all over the place. I mean, there are 3 or 4 of them within walking distance of my house. And probably, unless you live in the hills or in the exurbs, there are probably several that were within walking distance of your house, or certainly a very short drive. In Houston, Texas, there's one. Imagine that if in Los Angeles County, the only drop box where you could put in your signed envelope with your ballot was at the Hall of Administration at 500 West Temple Street at Temple and Grand. And the whole county who wanted to deposit their votes in a drop box had to do it there. It's impossible. It's designed to reduce the engagement of people in the voting process. It's designed to discourage people from voting, and that's exactly what's happening now. It doesn't matter to the end result if there's a one-sided result. So you can have voter suppression in California, but Trump is going to. Hillary won in California by 2-1, 64-37 or 64-34, something along those lines in 2016, and Biden will do at least as well. So if you suppress 3, 4, 5% of the vote in California, it may make a difference in a congressional seat. It's not going to make a difference to who's going to be who's going to win the state in the presidential contest. But if you're in Pennsylvania and it gets down to 2 or 3%, as it did 4 years ago, and that spread narrows and continues to narrow, goes from 7 to 5 to 4 to 3, and all of a sudden voter suppression can make a difference. I'll give you another example of where it could make a difference. Georgia is a very close election right now, both for the presidential race and for the 2 Senate races they have. There's one of the 2 because they have a vacancy. One of the 2 seats is a dead heat. The Democrats actually have a chance, if it was a fair election, actually have a chance to win a Senate seat in Georgia. But they're doing the same thing in Georgia that they've done in Harris County. In Georgia, with the long lines that I described a minute ago, if it's a dead heat, on a fair level playing field, Well, it won't take much to suppress the vote down to a point where the Democrat can't get the majority of the vote. And that will have not only an impact on the presidential contest, but it would have an impact on the senatorial contest, which could be important. The Georgia race could be important. Obviously, the Senate contests overall are extremely important. So that's the danger sign that I want to put out there, the warning sign. Right now, and for the last several weeks, months, actually, the last couple, 3 months, the polls have been pretty much static, up a point or two, down a point or two. They haven't moved. There hasn't been this wave in one direction or another because of some external event. It's still possible there will be an external event, some October surprise, but it's less and less likely every day. The only surprise we've been seeing is how incompetent a campaigner the president is, and how he's totally botched this thing from the COVID crisis to his own personal crisis with COVID. Anyway, enough about him. But if the election narrows in any of these states in the last couple 3 weeks, and they do tend to narrow as you get closer to the election, if they narrow close enough, then some of these voter suppression tactics could work. There are a lot of other techniques. I won't go into them too much. It would take too much time. The last thing I want to talk about, and then I want to open it up to your questions, if you have any, and we can have kind of a virtual conversation here. The Senate race. Obviously, the Senate, as those of you who've been watching the confirmation hearings for the Supreme Court nominee realize how high the stakes are for who controls the United States Senate, not just on the Supreme Court issues, but on whatever has to be done to fix what has gone wrong in the last 4 years, and to use Biden's slogan, to build the country back even better than it was. You're going to have both houses of the Senate, of the Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives. Mitch McConnell has made it very clear from day one when Obama was there, and he's made it clear again, he will frustrate any Democratic agenda, not because it's a bad agenda, but because he doesn't want them to succeed. And that was his mission when he became the leader during the Obama administration, and he succeeded in making it very difficult for Obama to get anything done. Whatever Obama got done, he got done through executive orders, some legislation, but so many of his initiatives were stillborn because they ran into the cul-de-sac called Mitch McConnell's Senate. So the Senate is a very big deal. And here's the kind of the exciting thing. A year ago, nobody would have given you 2 cents for the possibility that the Democrats could take over the Senate, because most of the people running for in the Senate, the 33 Senate seats that are up, are mostly Republican, and most of them were considered to be safe seats for the Republicans. And it would just take this gargantuan miracle for the Democrats to get 4 seats, 3 seats to tie them, and 4 seats to get a bare majority. And assuming that the Democrats had the White House and the tiebreaker would be the president, you would need 3 seats. And then we have the one senator in Alabama, a Democrat, Doug Jones, who everybody assumes is not going to be able to it will not be reelected. Everybody assumes that. I would not assume that. I wouldn't bet my firstborn son on it, or daughter. Both of them will be happy to know that. But it's not beyond the realm of possibility. He's got a terrible opponent, a terrible candidate, I should say. He's not a terrible opponent. A guy who used to be the head football coach at Auburn University. And he's got some baggage. Doug Jones is a very solid guy, so he may survive. But let's assume for a minute that he doesn't survive. The Democrats need to get 4 seats in order to have 3 net seats, plus the presidency and the vice presidency, so that they could control the Senate. Well, it looks like there are 4 seats where the Democrats are doing very well. 4 states, I should say. One is Maine, where Susan Collins is finally going to have her comeuppance. She has, deceived her constituency long enough, and I think they finally have gotten the hang of, that she, when the Republican caucus needed her vote, she delivered, and the Kavanaugh confirmation, I think, did her in, and a number of other things. I think she's in trouble. So the Democrats could pick up, and I would bet will pick up Maine. They're going to pick up Colorado, where the incumbent governor, the incumbent senator is not popular, and the person running against him is the former governor, John Hickenlooper, who was former mayor of Denver. I got to know him on homeless issues. He actually is one of the success stories when it comes to doing something about homelessness. Hickenlooper will win that race. I think it's pretty clear that Mark Kelly is going to win in Arizona, the astronaut in Arizona, to beat McSally, who lost her election 2 years ago, and she's not doing very well. And that's three. And then North Carolina, who knew that their incumbent senator Tillis was not popular, was in trouble. And who knew that he would have an opponent who would end up in a sex scandal just a week ago, a sexting scandal with a woman who is not his wife. But that doesn't seem to have made an impression on the voters in North Carolina, and he's still ahead by several points. So it's conceivable that North Carolina may go Democratic in the Senate race. And then there are three other states. There's Iowa, Georgia, and South Carolina. I mentioned Georgia already, so I won't repeat that. Iowa, the Senator Ernst Iowa has had a terrible year. They had a hurricane, literally a hurricane, that destroyed basically the entire crop in the harvest season this year. It destroyed their economy. And aside from which, I think Iowans are just tired of what they've been seeing. And the presidential election in Iowa is very close, but Ernst is behind. And I wouldn't put it in a sure column. I'm not as sure about her as I am about three or four of the ones that I just mentioned, but that's definitely in play. And then South Carolina, which I'm just reporting to you what the data says. My gut tells me this is impossible to beat Lindsey Graham in South Carolina. However, all of the polls have been showing for weeks now that it's a dead heat. They're tied, 48-48. Harrison against Lindsey Graham. And, this is where a blowout makes a difference. If this is a wave election, if there is an overwhelming tsunami of Democratic votes, and if some Republicans decide not to show up, that they've just had enough of him and they're not going to inconvenience themselves in this environment to go out and vote for Trump, then the people down ticket, the Republicans who are running for the Senate and for Congress and for state legislative seats will pay the price for it. Because if I'm a Republican, or a Democrat for that matter, and I don't show up, it's not just the presidential election I'm not voting for, it's also all the down ballot races. So no other expert, no better expert than Rick Santorum, the former conservative senator from Pennsylvania, after the debate a couple of weeks ago, said that if he was a Republican running for re-election to the Senate right now, he'd be very upset by the president's performance, because it could turn them off, not to Santorum or not to a Lindsey Graham, but it could turn them off to the president. And then, for a lot of people, just going to vote for president is well to get them to the polls. That's why we have the highest turnout during presidential elections. During the off-year elections, people don't show up because they really only want to vote for president. It's a big mistake for people to think that way, but that's the way it is. And if Republicans don't show at the polls in a state like South Carolina, it could happen. And my pollster for many years told me in a conversation I had, he says, in these big wave elections like 1980 and Ronald Reagan, I think pretty much everybody in this call remembers that election. It was a big wave. Nobody thought he was going to win 49 states, well, he didn't win 49 in 1980, but nobody thought he was going to win by the percentage he did. And nobody thought that the Senate would go Republican. But in a wave election, it was a tsunami, not just a wave, but a tsunami. And U.S. senators, Democratic senators who had been institutions in Washington, found themselves out of a job after that election. That's what happens in a tsunami, in a wave kind of an election. If that's what this turns out to be, then a South Carolina, a Georgia, an Iowa it would certainly be in play. I think there's another couple of elections that bear watching in the Senate, and then I will stop. Watch Alaska. I'm advised that that the guy who's running against Senator Sullivan is not to be discounted, and nobody pays any attention to Alaska because it's in another time zone, literally and figuratively. And Montana, where the incumbent Democratic governor, Steve Bullock, is running for the Senate. He's been running behind by 3 or so points, but in a wave election, that could, 3%, 2% could easily melt away. So when you count all of those up, that's 10 seats that, and maybe 8 really, realistically, I should say, that are in play. And in a wave election, you could have a President Biden, a Vice President Harris, in a U.S. Senate that has 55 or 56 Democrats. That's the best case scenario. I don't believe we should think about the best case scenario. We could dream about it in our sleep, but in our waking hours, I think what keeps me up at night is voter suppression, intimidation in the polls, which the right-wing militia people have been called upon to do. Those are the kinds of things that we need to worry about. And then, of course, the question that everybody wonders is, if it's a close result at the end of the day, will Trump leave the White House? I'm less concerned about that than I was a few weeks ago, but it still has me concerned because I've seen it happen in other parts of the world. And we are beginning to mimic other parts of the world in so many of our electoral processes. I will just say in conclusion that if I was an election observer in another country, monitoring an election like the one we are having right now, I think our conclusion would be that it was not a fair election, or that if the incumbent, if the regime was not overthrown through a free election, if a regime was overthrown, that it was despite the fact that there had been this election manipulation through voter suppression and things like that. This has been an ugly thing, and it's the result of the Voting Rights Act being allowed to expire, the protections that the Voting Rights Act offered. 20 states, as you may have heard during the judiciary hearings, but 20 states ended up making it much more difficult for people to vote, something that was not permitted under the Voting Rights Act before it expired. So there's a long agenda, a long list of things that we need to do to correct this democracy, because the democracy is at stake. And I don't consider that hyperbole. I'm a student of history. I've watched what this guy has done in 3.5 years. And he's done it in the last 2 years, because in the first year and a half, he had some institutional people around him who held him back. But the last 2 years, he's managed to take over the judiciary system, to take over the justice system, to politicize it completely. Imagine what he could do with another 4 years. I don't think we would recognize our country if that happened. So the stakes are high. Vote early. Don't wait till the last minute. And however you vote, make sure you vote early so your vote gets counted. With that, I'll stop. And Hank, are you gonna?
Yeah, I will go over the questions.
Okay.
We have a whole raft of questions that are very similar, and it really touches on a question that you began to address towards the end of your talk. And essentially, we have a lot of our members who pose the question: what will in fact happen if Trump loses the election and refuses to leave the White House?
Yeah. So I've asked that question a lot of legal scholars and political historians, and the reason I'm so uptight about it is when I did my in 2011, I did an election observation in Nigeria. I mentioned that, and And I was in the bathroom shaving in my hotel, and I had Al Jazeera television, which is actually, Al Jazeera English, which is a very good station. They cover Africa very well. So I'm listening with one ear as I'm shaving, and they were talking about the president of the Ivory Coast, the Côte d'Ivoire, who had lost his election 11 months earlier and had refused to leave the presidential palace. And the army was trying to negotiate a deal with him, and it was some news story. And I said, geez, how interesting. That could never happen in America. Imagine a president loses the election, George H.W. Bush, Jimmy Carter, and says, I'm not leaving, come and get me. Or in the case of Donald Trump, what worries me is that he makes a plea to his biker friends, Bikers for Trump, and invites every biker in America to come and surround the White House. Hundreds of thousands of people. They'd love to do this. Okay, come and get me. Come through those bikers. Look, here's, I try not to think with my heart. I think with my brain, and I also use my gut, but my heart can be very, very deceiving. If it's a one-sided election, I say one-sided, an indisputable result. If Biden wins in Florida and he wins in the three swing states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin and Michigan, and let's say he wins Ohio and Arizona and North Carolina, there's not going to be an issue. Someone told me the power of the office doesn't reside in the House, at the White House. It resides with the person. So when the election is declared, and the Electoral College, assuming there's no hanky-panky there, and it'd be very difficult to have hanky-panky played with the Electoral College if it's a one-sided election. If in Wisconsin or Pennsylvania, which is where they're really playing games, if the election is a 5 or 6 point margin, any challenge would just fizzle. This is, the only reason Gore v. Bush happened was because there were a few hundred votes separating them. If there's 1%, the governor of Kentucky, a Republican, lost the election last year by 1%, and he didn't demand a recount. So everybody knows what the statistical probabilities are on these things. So if the Democrat wins, or either way, if the Democrat wins by 4 or 5 or 6 points in these key states or more, I don't think that will be an issue. And I think even Republicans, which is a big assumption I'm making, and I will admit it because they've shown no evidence of any statesmanship heretofore in this iteration of Republican senators. But I think some of the Republican leaders will stand up and say enough is enough. So I'm less worried about that. I am worried about violence. I'm worried about the violence that that the president has unleashed. Okay, his comment at the end of the debate a couple of weeks ago, where he said, in response to the question whether he would peacefully transition if he lost, and they got into a discussion about white supremacy, and then would you condemn white supremacy? And he wouldn't. And then he told these Proud Boys, this group of militia, to stand back and stand by, which to me, it sent a chill up my spine. That was an invitation to violence. Stand by, wait for the signal from us, and we'll tell you what to do. Look, white supremacy and white supremacist militias are a very significant issue to law enforcement. The FBI has said so. Local law enforcement, state attorneys general have said so. We did a paper. I wasn't personally involved in it, but the Luskin Center for History and Policy in the UCLA History Department did an extensive paper on the history of white supremacy in California, and it was, I've grown up, born and raised in California, and it shocked me. It takes a lot to shock me, but and what's going on now is quite dangerous. And I mean, these are terrorists. Anybody who's going to threaten to kidnap a governor, not just of Michigan, but of Virginia, as it turns out, these are terrorists. And what they might do, Trump may have lost control over these people at this point. They may just say, they're not going after my guy, our guy. And that's what worries me a little bit. And let's hope that that doesn't happen. And if there is a problem, let's hope that our law enforcement people do their job.
Yeah, there's been some speculation that part of Trump's strategy in contesting judicially a lot of the elections is to ultimately throw the election into the House of Representatives, where each state has one vote for each state delegation.
Right.
And he figures that, at least based on the current constituency of the House, that Trump would be able to be elected in that manner.
Yeah. So I'm not as concerned about that. Number one, each state would, each delegation in the House would have, from each state would have one vote. So California has one vote, and North Carolina has one, and North Dakota has one vote. North Dakota, where, you know, Buffalo outnumbered people, you know, 10,000 to 1. Another structural inequity that we have in our political system. But this will not be an issue if the election is not, you know, razor thin close. If there's a 0.5% separating or 1% separating somebody in a state like Wisconsin, where I believe the Republicans have a 1 vote edge in their congressional delegation, I don't think that the state legislature in Wisconsin, if there's a 7-point victory for Biden, is going to play games. And I don't even think that Justice Barrett, if she becomes justice, could really, with a straight face, vote to invalidate the election that is decisive. And decisive doesn't mean 7 points; it could mean 3 points. As I said, the Kentucky governor who lost wouldn't even call for a recount for 1%, a 1% loss. So, and having been through elections, although never a close one, but I've been involved in close ones with other candidates. It's hard to overturn an election where there's a 3, 4, 5% spread. I mean, there isn't that much fraud. You couldn't have that much fraud or those kinds of mistakes or machine errors. It just doesn't happen. And that's why nobody goes to spend the money on a recount or anything of that sort. So I'm not worried about that. However, there are some Democrats who are spending some money on these states where there's a chance to pick up a congressional seat or two, which would flip the delegation from having a 1-vote Republican majority to a 1-vote Democratic majority, in which case the 26-24 Republican edge in the House delegations could flip, or it could tie, in which case I don't know what happens if it ties. I don't know if I think the governors of each state, I'm not an expert on that, so I don't know. But I don't think that's going to happen. I really, I think this is people who have done a great service to all of us by looking at all the possibilities. But I don't think the election is going to be a 1/3% in each of 6 swing states. It's not likely.
One of our members asked how significant is the silent or shy Trump supporter who is so ashamed to tell anybody, including the pollsters, that they will vote for Trump. Do you think that is going to be is that a factor in the current poll numbers, or is it not something that you are concerned about?
Well, I'm less concerned about it than I was in 1982 when Tom Bradley ran for governor against George Deukmejian. Clearly, there were a lot of people who told the pollsters that they were voting for Bradley and didn't. So I think that's changed a lot. I don't think that's the major concern. I think we can look at the 2018 election just 2 years ago, where the Democrats, that was a wave election where the Democrats took over the House and with a big majority. Look, where have things changed? Trump did well among women, non-college age educated women in suburban communities last time. He did very well among men. He did well among older folks, the Medicare generation. He's losing all those people right now. And so, take a look at Florida. Florida's got a lot of old folks, a lot of senior citizens. Why has that happened? Are they afraid to tell the pollster something? No, they're not afraid to tell the pollster something. just 2 nights ago, he basically threw senior citizens under the bus. You know, herd immunity. Just you'll be fine, and we can't run this whole country around any one constituency. These are my words, not his. Basically, he has repeatedly thrown senior citizens under the bus. Herd immunity, and there are probably some physicians in the audience. I'm not a physician. It may be a tactic, but there's a price to be paid for it, and the people who pay the price are the elderly. So people in Florida are, excuse my French, pissed. Who's he to? He's 74 years old. Let him go out and get herd immunity. Well, he did, and I don't think we're through. I don't think he's through with his virus yet. That's my bet. Anyway, I don't. So there has been a change in the demographic of his support. So what is his strategy? It's been to those of you who play poker in the audience, he's run his whole campaign back in 2016 and his whole administration like he was drawing to an inside straight flush. All right, that's what he's doing. He's trying to grow his base. He has not tried to expand his base. The most elementary thing for him to have done when COVID happened was to suspend his campaign, go back to the White House, bring Democrats and Republicans together, and have a coalition. You know, the American people were waiting. In a time of crisis, they'll fall in line with the leader. In a time of war, in a time of pandemic. And what did he do? He starts going after a few weeks, he starts going after Dr. Fauci. And what really bothered him about Fauci was that he was more popular than Trump. And that came across, that he actually started to say it at one of his press conferences, and he caught himself. But that's really what it was all about. And people are tired of this. And in the case of COVID, everybody now knows somebody who's had COVID, right? I mean, we all know, and certainly in LA, we know people who've had it. And many of us know people who've died of it. I know several people who've died of COVID, and personal friends. So there comes a point where, you can't yell fake news about that anymore, because you see it. It's your aunt, your grandmother, your cousin. And his credibility. It's one thing to just go with the flow, and he's an entertainer, and the economy is good, my 401k is good, so I can tolerate all this stuff. But when your life's on the line, it's a different story. And once you lose your credibility, it's gone. You can't recover it. I want to tell you a quick story, which I used. I told my class that I teach in the spring that happened to me in Ukraine in 2004. I was an observer in the presidential election in Ukraine in December 26, 2004. And I'm sorry, I'm confusing. I was in Ukraine in 1993, conducting seminars on local government, different trip. And the woman who was the staff person for the Kiev City Council, who was kind of advancing their end of things, invited our delegation to dinner at her one-room apartment, her Soviet-style apartment in downtown Kiev, and which we were happy to do, and we had a great meal. And at one point I turned to her and I said, "How did you get involved in this democratization business in Ukraine?" This is 1993, 3 years after Gorbachev was toppled and Yeltsin is now president, et cetera. And Ukraine is independent by this time. It's not even part of Russia at that point. And she said, "Well, it's interesting." She said it started with Chernobyl, which I think was 1986 or 87. When Chernobyl happened, Gorbachev was in charge of the Soviet Union, and he said, "We have it under control. There's no problem. We've contained everything. No worries." And then a few months later, pregnant women started to deliver babies with deformities. Kids were starting to get cancer. 6, 7, 8-year-old kids. Talk about it as a cluster would have been an understatement. And everybody assumed that this, because they were downwind of Chernobyl, and so she said, I was never interested in freedom of the press or freedom of assembly or any of that stuff. I wasn't going to risk my life or my well-being for that. But don't get between me and my daughter. That's what she said, words that are etched in my psyche. Don't get between me and my daughter. She had a 13-year-old daughter. She was a single mom. And this would have been 6 years earlier, so her daughter would have been 7, 8 years old. And when the COVID hit, I said, he's in trouble. Because it's one thing to say, repeal Obamacare, it's a fraud. It's another, it's one thing to say the China virus. It's another thing to say that all the baloney that he spews, fake news this, fake news that. As long as I have a job and my pension is secure, I can tolerate all this stuff. But when you start seeing your own friends and relatives biting the dust, that's a different story. And I said, this is going to be his undoing. Now, it took a long time for it to be his undoing. I thought it would have been his undoing a few months ago. But I think the one thing that has killed him, politically killed him, is that the way he's handled or failed to handle COVID. And it's not gotten any better, right? I mean, you open today's paper, it's on its third surge now across the country, and most of them in red states. Remember, he talked about it being only a blue state problem because the Democratic governors couldn't do their job. Well, now it's North Dakota, it's Wisconsin. 3,000 people contracted the virus just in one day earlier this week. I talked to a friend of mine in Madison. North Dakota is off the charts. I don't know how many of you have been to North Dakota. One of the things that I used to fantasize, if I had to get out of LA or California to get away from the virus, I'd go to North Dakota. Nothing like Fargo, not Fargo, Bismarck in the middle of nowhere. But now they've got the problem. So it's a colossal political problem, which he brought upon himself. And here we are. So I don't know, just to bring it back to your original question, I do believe he's damaged goods. And now, having said all of that, you compare him to, you can't beat somebody with nobody, as a friend of mine used to say. Joe Biden is a decent guy. He's got a great record. He's got, not that we would all agree with him on everything. He's been around 47 years. I was around 40 years. People pick apart my record too, things that I did in 1978 that I wouldn't do today, but I did it in 78. And so, but the people aren't going to put a microscope or a magnifying glass to his record. They're going to put a telescope on his character and on his soul. And Gray Davis, our former governor, who lives not far from UCLA and has spoken to my class a couple of times, made a very interesting observation. He says, every election is a reaction to the previous election. So Arnold Schwarzenegger was a reaction to Gray Davis, and Barack Obama was a reaction to George W. Bush, and Trump was a reaction to Obama, and the next guy is going to be a reaction to Trump. And I think at the end of the day, that's what we're facing, hopefully, unless it's manipulated in ways beyond our control. But I think things are looking a little more optimistic certainly a lot more optimistic than they were 4 years ago.
Zev, in some states, and I believe Florida is one of them,
Mm-hmm.
absentee votes they start tabulating them as they come in. Other states like California does not begin the tabulation process until election day itself.
Right.
Is there any reason why more states cannot begin the processing of the absentee ballots upon receipt rather than waiting till the
it's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that. I don't know whether it's an optics issue. People are afraid that if you count them earlier, maybe you can manipulate the vote. I mean, I'm just thinking of different conspiracy scenarios, but I don't know why we don't do it, especially in LA County, where the absentee ballots come in. By the way, we do count the absentees that come in early, right? In California. So we will count for example, you send in your ballot today, or you drop it in the Dropbox today. that vote's going to get counted and reported at 8:05 on Tuesday, November 3rd, because they count the ballot. They'll verify your signature. They'll do all the verification. And once they've done that, then they put it in the scanner and they'll count them. In previous elections, when you had a lot of people voting absentee and by mail, but still a majority of them, or 50-50, were voting on the same day. And so, and the votes the ballots that come in, say on Saturday or Sunday or Monday before the election, they still have to verify the signatures, and those won't get verified until after Tuesday. So they get counted later. So I think there will be more California votes counted ahead of time. When I say will be counted and reported after the polls close, immediately after the polls close, if they've been received long enough in advance. And there are going to be a lot of votes received in advance. Those that aren't will be counted over. Now, in a close election, people are going to wait and sit on pins and needles waiting for the next report. And I've done it myself. When I've supported candidates or I have an interest in a candidate, they report them every Tuesday and every Friday for about 3 or 4 weeks after the election, and you wait. I'll give you an example. The sheriff's election 2 years ago between Jim McDonnell, who was the incumbent sheriff here in our county, and Sheriff Villanueva, who won. When the absentee ballots came in, McDonnell was ahead 53-47. When all of the votes were counted, Villanueva was ahead 53-47. It was that much of a switch, and there are a lot of reasons for that. His vote came out on election day. They're more same-day voters than they are vote-by-mail voters. We just did a paper at the Center for History and Policy, the Luskin Center at UCLA, on the history of voter access, and really with a focus on vote-by-mail. And one of the conclusions we came to, it's not rocket science, I don't think we're original, but we quantified it, is that despite all of the advances we've made in expanding the franchise, still the whites, more affluent whites, overperform, or have a higher voter participation rate than people of color and lower income people. There are a lot of reasons for that. In the case of Latinos, and Asians, still a lot of them have not become citizens. Once they become citizens, they'll vote. But they're working people. Some of them work, morning till night. They can't. They're not computer literate. So when we tell them go online and print yourself out an application and then send it in, most of them don't have, not most of them, a good percentage of them don't have computers at home, and they can't just do that. So, and for some people, buying a 55-cent stamp is, first of all, to go to the post office and buy stamps now and stand in line at the post office to buy stamps is taking your life into your hands, unless you're wearing a mask, and most people do. But still, people don't want to be around other people. So there are a lot of reasons why there's this institutional discrimination against people who want to vote absentee, and so a lot of people like to vote, myself included, like to vote on election day. I have always voted on election day. Never voted absent. Once I voted absentee because I was going to be out of the country on election day. It happened to be the 2000 election. And I got to watch the election returns in a Tokyo hotel room and watch Tom Brokaw say, "We can't call California because the votes in Los Angeles County have not been counted yet." And this is back to your question, why does it take so long? And LA County is a big place. We are the biggest county in the country, and we have the most voters in the country, and of any jurisdiction. And it takes time for them to count, and it hasn't gotten any better with the new system. But I have no question about the integrity of the process.
Are there any legislative solutions, either on the national level or at the state level, that you would think that we should consider in terms of voter suppression?
Well, I'm not an expert on this. I've talked to Secretary of State Alex Padilla, who is a leader in this area nationally. He's among the national secretaries of state. He's considered to be a leader. He's a very smart guy. I've known him since he first got elected. I think they're putting a to-do list together. I think secretaries of state, both Democrats and some Republican secretaries of state, are looking at the first order of business is to restore the Voting Rights Act. Those parts of the Voting Rights Act that expired that have allowed states to basically go back to a Jim Crow type of election apparatus. I mean, one drop box in Harris County, Texas, Houston, Texas is, need I say more? What they've done in Georgia, Stacey Abrams, who ran for governor 2 years ago in Georgia, lost by a 0.5% or 1%. It was very, very close. And she lost because of voter suppression. And, there's nothing she could do about it. She did. I don't think she filed a lawsuit on it at all. And she was very statesmanlike about it, but she became committed to doing something about voter suppression. I believe it has to be federal law. I mean, that's what Lyndon Johnson believed in, or was pushed to believe in 1965 with the Voting Rights Act, when you had to read large sections of the Constitution to prove your literacy. We have a sordid history in California when it comes to voter suppression. I mean, we used to have literacy tests here. Our Constitution, the state of California Constitution, actually in the Constitution barred Chinese from voting. It barred them from becoming. It barred them from voting, and you had to prove that you were literate in English, which discriminated against immigrants. I mean, my dad, when he came to New York from the old country in 1921, even in 1927, when he got his citizenship, I don't think he could have, recited the Gettysburg Address, even if he had to read it. It took him a while to learn the language. So there are all kinds of things all kinds of tactics and techniques, but the one thing that you have to do is you have to make voting accessible, and different modalities of voting. So you don't just vote by mail. Some people won't vote by mail. Some people need the 55 cents to put milk on the table, or a portion of a carton of milk on the table. Some people want to vote. African Americans, we have a professor at UCLA, Laurie Frazier, who's a brilliant expert on gender and racial voting history. She's in the political science department. We had a panel, a webinar like this a couple of weeks ago, and we talked about our paper, our project. And she said that in the case of Blacks, especially in the South, but not just in the South, the struggle for voting rights is so ingrained in their psyche and in their history that they want to come and come to they want to go to the polling place and show themselves, and stand there and say, I'm here. There's an old Hebrew, my parents were Hebrew teachers, so I rarely resorted to Hebrew, even though I went to Hebrew school all those years. But there's a word out of the Bible, hineni, here I am. And it comes from the Cain and Abel story, when God says, where are you? Hineni, here I am. Well, hineni is what they want to go to the polling place and show. They don't want to mail it. They want to be anonymous. They want to, they want to honor the struggle of 100 years or more of voter discrimination, of racial discrimination, of the 400 years of slavery. I mean, it's all wrapped up in this, that they want to be there to vote. And here in this environment, they're going to have to make a choice between vote by mail, vote, or take a risk, on the COVID side. So, but there needs to be a restoration of the voting rights laws, and I think those voting rights laws need to be expanded now that we've seen new tricks, and make it a federal crime to do the kinds of things that are being done in Houston and in Atlanta and in Cleveland, Ohio. It's got to be a fair and level playing field. Otherwise, we don't have a democracy that is accessible to all, and therefore we don't have a really functioning democracy. And I think we're getting a sense of it this year.
Assuming that Joe Biden does win the White House, do you have any thoughts on who might replace Kamala Harris as senator?
Well, I have a lot of thoughts, but I don't know that my thoughts are. Look, I think he's going to. I think it's a little early to talk about that, but I think it would be a person. I wouldn't be surprised, and it would make a lot of sense for it to be a Latino or Latinx. Um, there's some people who say it should be a woman. There are Latinas in the state. I'm not sure, you have to pigeonhole it that closely, but I think there are some serious people in that regard who are, the governor's going to make that appointment. As most of you probably know, if there's a vacancy in the Senate seat, the governor appoints the successor or the replacement. And Alex Padilla, who I mentioned earlier, is a early supporter of the governor and close to him. I don't know that Javier Becerra is interested in the job, but he would certainly be a logical, statewide office holder who's already won an election, as has Padilla. And there are others. I mean, it could be it could be an African American. There's some stars in that regard. Karen Bass, who's a congresswoman with whom I worked for many years, both as a congresswoman and as former speaker of the state legislature, the state assembly. She would be someone who would be looked at. And once you start going down the list, there's no end to it. So but I think it'll be a person of color. And the good thing is that there's a really deep bench of people, thanks to the Voting Rights Act and thanks to inclusion in the political process. There are a lot of people who we used to call minorities, but they're now in the majority, at least collectively, who would make great senators. So yeah, I don't have any particular idea in that other than the obvious ones.
We have a number of our members who've asked questions relating to local issues. For example, when we look at the Black Lives Matter issues in Los Angeles, do you see any action being taken with respect to the request by some for defunding the LAPD or the Metro Police?
Yeah, it's an interesting subject. It's an unfortunate term that was chosen by whoever chose it. I think it was probably organic, defunding the police. I know of no responsible public official who wants to defund the police if defunding the police means to eviscerate their budget and have no police officers or very few police officers. Let's send a social worker out when there's a mental health case. Look, two things I will say about my own career, just to give you my street cred on this. My fights with Daryl Gates over constitutional policing are legendary. On police intelligence, on the chokehold, on excessive use of force, on the use of their guns, just the whole 9 yards. And that was in an era when there was no Black Lives Matter organization and there wasn't this kind of political movement that has emerged, which is a good thing. But as a county supervisor for 20 years, and we have thousands of social workers who work for the County of Los Angeles in the welfare department and mental health department and other departments. If you get a call, a 911 call, that there's a mentally ill person known to be mentally ill who's acting out and doing something crazy, you don't want the social worker going there alone. Absolutely not. We've had social workers who have been killed by their clients. One in Santa Monica, just disconnect that phone. It's another fundraising call from the Democratic Party. Hang on a second. Sorry about that. We had a social worker killed in her office in Santa Monica, working for the Department of Public and Social, mental health department. So On the natural, if you were in charge of dispatching people and there's somebody who is totally out of control and violent, even if they don't have a weapon, but they're violent or they may have a knife in their hand, you're not going to send a social worker on his or her own to try to bring them down to, to calm them down. Not going to happen. You're going to send them with somebody who can defend that social worker. It's just common sense. Now, so defunding the police or saying just send a social worker and you don't need the police is the sign of somebody who really has never operated in that environment. Now, having said that, the system that we have, the culture that we have in our law enforcement agencies, the militaristic kind of culture that has been the problem with law enforcement and there, I was going to say to the extent that there is a problem. I don't think you have to say that qualifier. There are problems within law enforcement, without a doubt, and part of it stems from this militaristic approach to their job. One of the things I tried to do, and I did it with some success, even over Daryl Gates's objection, was to encourage the LAPD. This was in the late '80s. To hire more female police officers. Now, females didn't want to apply to the LAPD because they thought it was a hostile work environment, and they were right. We never made them feel welcome. What are the requirements to be a police officer? You got to climb a 6-foot wall. Well, most women can't climb a 6-foot wall. By the way, most men can't climb a 6-foot wall. I used to joke with the chief of police, not Gates, but his successor. I said, why don't you try to jump the 6-foot wall? It's ridiculous. But women, the reason we were so focused on women is because women police officers have the ability to de-escalate a confrontational situation in a way that a male officer can't. I'm not a scientist. I'm not going to tell you what the reason is for it, but the statistics are very clear that when you come into especially in a domestic violence confrontation, which are among the most dangerous that a police officer ever gets to, they can talk people into, settling down, calming down, a female officer more than a male officer. So we try to set up a quota of trying to have every class of LAPD recruits have 30% women. In order to do that, you have to convince women that you really are wanted. In the promotional materials, you don't show, a big airship with machine guns and rappelling off the, like a SWAT team. You can show female police officers actually doing law enforcement work or social work kinds of things to show that this is valued in the organization. And we have a long way to go on that. Now, having said that, the LAPD is way ahead of a lot of law enforcement agencies around the country, not because they're geniuses, but because they've been through a lot and they learned some lessons from it. Bill Bratton was a great chief of police when he came here. He's the right man at the right time, implemented the Christopher Commission reforms, dealt with the Rampart issue, the consent decree that we had. We don't use the chokehold. The chokehold was banned in LA in 1982. I had a lot to do with that. I chaired the police committee those 2 years, 81 and 82. And I don't think that year we had 17 deaths as a result of the chokehold. I don't think we've had a chokehold death in LA City since 1982. And so when I see something like in Manhattan or George Floyd, who was choked not by an arm, but by a knee, I'm just aghast that, where have they been? Learn from some of the agencies that have like LA, which have had a lot of unrest as a result of police excessive use of force issues. So but to be more direct about your question, defunding the police means different things to different people. Do I believe that we ought to change the culture in the police department? Absolutely. Do I believe that we ought to redirect some of the resources that go to certain aspects of law enforcement and put them into a more humanistic side of that organization and boost and build up that humanistic side? Absolutely. Do I believe in having no police department at all? No, and neither does anybody else within the sound of my voice. Next time you need to call 911, you're not going to want a social worker. You're going to want somebody who can defend you. And you know, and there's a big gulf between that and the kinds of stuff we saw and we see here in LA, and we see in Kenosha, Wisconsin, or Minneapolis, Minnesota, or Atlanta, Georgia. Anyway, I think this whole reckoning that we're going through right now, and George Floyd, I mean, it's like Rodney King on steroids. I mean, you know, for LA, the Rodney King, and for the country, but mainly in LA, the Rodney King episode, because it was on video, just shook people to their core. And a lot was changed as a result, but we didn't cross the finish line. The George Floyd and others, but the George Floyd video has been a national awakening, not only on law enforcement issues, but how to address other structural inequities that adversely affect and discriminatorily affect people of color, and particularly African Americans. And I think that's been an education. I will tell you, I've learned a lot as a result of this. I've read a lot of history over the summer, trying to understand, you know, the antecedents of what we're going through now. My good friend Connie Rice, who has been a police reform advocate for many, many years, for decades. I've had her speak to my class, talks about you know, the way we structure law enforcement today is a throwback to how slaves were kept on the plantation, and that's true. And the whole concept of law enforcement really stems from those days. That's got to change. And if defunding the police means you know, changing that culture, changing the mission statement, you know, I'm all for it. But we do have bad guys and bad gals in this, mostly bad guys in our society, and they need to be accounted for as well.
Let me ask you one final question. One of our members wrote that LA has not done a good job dealing with homeless encampments on the street. What, if anything, can be done about that? What should we do differently?
Well, it's a good last question, and I'll try to answer it in the time we have left. You know, homelessness became an issue for me in the early to mid 2000s, before it became the politically hot issue that it is today. My daughter was a student at the Kennedy School of Government, and during the summer between her 2 years there, she worked for the city of Oakland in one of the social service departments. She called me one night. She said, "Dad, I was sitting on Telegraph Avenue in Berkeley today. I was walking up Telegraph Avenue, and there was a homeless person sitting on the curb, and I sat down and engaged him in conversation for about 20 minutes. And if you knew my daughter, you'd know she would do this sort of thing. And when the time I had to get going, I opened my purse to give him a couple of dollars, and he said, "I don't want your money. You've given me something far more valuable. You've given me your respect and your time." And I told my daughter, that's very touching. And then she said, "And Dad, while we were sitting there for 20 minutes, hundreds of people walked by us, and not one of them made eye contact with either one of us." And that got my attention, because I realized I never made eye contact with a homeless person either. When I came off the Hollywood freeway on Melrose, which was my off-ramp to go home, the homeless person who had the franchise for that off-ramp, I never looked him in the eye, because if I did, I'd have to do something. And I realized that I was hiding behind that no eye contact business, you know, out of sight, out of mind. I don't have to do anything. And that really changed my life. I hired a woman who, fortuitously, Flora Gill-Kristoloff, who ran for the city council and lost in the far west side in Brentwood and Palisades, lost to Bill Rosendahl, and I hired her. She was a former nurse, social worker, and I put her in charge of mental health, and quickly that evolved into homelessness, because mental health and homelessness are interrelated, obviously. And we missed an opportunity in the late 2000s. We created a program. I created a program along with Flora, a pilot that we went down into Skid Row. First, we brought people from all over the country who had done who had done something on homelessness and succeeded. This is how I met John Hickenlooper, the mayor, then mayor of Denver, soon to be a U.S. senator, I hope. And we had a conference here, a 1.5 day conference for people from all over the country. And make it a long story short, we asked them, what would you do if you were us? And they said, well, we've been here for a couple of days. We've been to Skid Row, and we think that unless you solve the problem on Skid Row, you're not going to solve homelessness in LA County. This is spawning all of the problems countywide. And so I said, so what would you do about it? He said, well, what we recommend you do is take a census of the number of homeless on Skid Row, identify the 50 or so most vulnerable people, the ones most likely to die if they remain on the street. And there's a whole system of doing that. And then make a beeline for those 50 people, get them housed, give them the services, and do this as a pilot program. This is where one of my favorite axioms that I coined around this time was, if you want to start a revolution, call it a pilot program, because it doesn't threaten anybody. This is just a pilot. If it works, great. If it doesn't work, we'll pull the plug on the pilot. And that's what we did. It was called Project 50. We actually housed 70 people. We were very successful. We had 92% retention rate. We housed them through the Skid Row Housing Trust, which is a very advanced homeless housing provider. County provided the services through the trust. We did a study. It was actually cheaper to house them and provide them services than to leave them on the street, because when we left them on the street, they ended up in jail or in the hospital or what have you, and that cost the taxpayers money. And I went to the Board of Supervisors and I asked them to scale this project up from 50 or 70 to 500. And then we'd go from 500 to 5,000. That was the problem. Wasn't what to do. The problem was having the will to do it and to spend the money, and we had the money to do it. And for a lot of reasons, which I won't get into, part of it is political jealousy and part of it was philosophical. I couldn't get a second vote to scale that up, even though it was manifest that this was the way to do it. And we lost a decade. And then homelessness got out of control. The courts got involved. You couldn't take people off the street because of constitutional rights as interpreted by the judges. And homelessness spread the city dispersed the homeless from Skid Row in some measure in the Central City East area, and they went all over town. So I started getting calls in 2014 from Pacific Palisades. I'd never had a call from Pacific Palisades about a homeless problem, but now we had a homeless encampment in Palisades Park and in places that you never had them before. And it's a good thing that happened, because this happened all over the county, all over the city and all over the county. And it became now a political problem for each politician, because it was no longer an intellectual thing. It was now something that if you didn't solve it, it could have an existential effect on your next re-election. And so the county put a tax measure on the ballot, and the city put a bond measure on the ballot for housing. And there's some real momentum there. The problem that still exists, and now I'm going to get to the heart of to answer the question that you posed, is there still isn't a complete consensus on what to do and how to do it, even though the model has been developed, not just by us in Project 50, but by cities and counties all over America. One of the things I asked the city to do after I was out of office, when Measure HHH, which was the $1.2 billion bond issue for housing, is I said, it's going to pass. And my suggestion is that you use that money to buy up motels. We did this in my district. We created almost 1,000 units for my supervisorial district, close to 1,000 units for homeless housing. Mentally ill homeless housing. We never had a NIMBY problem. We never had a problem. And how did we do it? We took over motels. We bought motels in partnership with nonprofit organizations. Many of the motels we have in our communities are not the greatest uses around. They're hangouts for illicit activity, and they can provide, with some remodeling and repurposing, they can provide housing very inexpensively and very quickly. I asked the city to focus on buying up motels, And the other good thing about motels is that they exist in every neighborhood in LA. They're in Bel Air, next to Bel Air on Sepulveda Boulevard, next to the freeway. They're in Westwood. There are 2 motels that are within walking distance of my house that I would have no problem, and neither would my neighbors have a problem with it. It'd be better than what's going on in those motels now, and we could do it quickly. They didn't do it. Now the governor has done it, called Project Room Key, and I think he's absolutely on the right track. And it's a statewide program. And that's the answer. Look, here's the way to solve homelessness is to provide people with a home. That's elementary. The second thing you have to do is you have to provide simultaneously the services that are required to address the issues that rendered them homeless in the first place. If it's a mental health issue, you need to have a psychiatrist or a psychologist. If it's a substance abuse issue, you've got to get them into a treatment program. If it's a medical issue, you got to get them a doctor. And many times it's all 3 of those things. And of course, economic things now with people being evicted from their apartments. That's the answer. It's not rocket science. It's political will. And in the meantime, the courts have prevented the city and the county from moving people off. And I'm not going to get into that issue. It's a mess. And hopefully, if they can start providing, motel rooms or other housing facilities at a very fast clip, the courts will allow you to move people off the street if you have a place to put them. And that's what we should do. That's the right thing to do. That's what they've done in New York for many years. Times Square used to be a hellhole, and now it's Times Square again, and has been for a decade or more. Those are the kinds of things we need to do. But the one last thing I'll say, Henry, and then we can call it a day. But the one thing I'll say to the listeners is homelessness did not occur overnight, and it's not going to get solved overnight. And I wish that our political leaders would just say that, so that they don't raise expectations that if you just pass this tax, we're going to solve the problem. Not going to happen. This did not happen overnight. We've had homelessness in this town for over a century. Now, the nature of the homelessness problem has changed. The demographics of it has changed, but we've had homelessness for 100 years. And the reason we still have it is because our society has not made eye contact with this issue. Just like we didn't make eye contact. The folks didn't make eye contact with my daughter and the homeless man she was sitting next to. That's the metaphor. We need to make eye contact with it, because if we do, we won't let go.
Viv, thank you so very, very much. It's been a wonderful and very enlightening presentation. I appreciate it. And for our members, I will ask you to circle November 19th on your calendar. Our next colloquium will be featuring Dan Schnur, Professor of Political Science at USC, Berkeley, and Pepperdine, who will be giving us a post-mortem on the election. So hopefully you'll join us then. Zev, thank you again for an enlightening and a very stimulating discussion.
Thanks. Thank you, Hank. It's an honor to be with all of you. Thank you all.
Thank you.